new edition of the program, What the Law Says. As you may be aware by now, What the Law Says is your premier legal platform for legal education and legal scholarship. We are aired here on ELBC 99.9 every Tuesday, 3 to 4 p.m. And then we also have a repeat here on ELBC on Saturday, 6 to 7 p.m. And we're also being streamed live from my own Facebook page, 𝐶𝐚𝐿 𝐿NTV, as well as from the official Facebook page of the Liberia Broadcasting System. So we'd like to welcome you and apologize for the few minutes of being late, traffic issues, but we're here and we're about to commence. Before we go back and come to tell you exactly what we're going to be dealing with today, we just like to give you a rundown of pretty much what our agenda today is supposed to or is going to look like. As a matter of fact, if this is your first time, we took the first 3 or so programs to engage in what we term as our foundational series of what the law is, or what the law says. The idea behind that foundational series was that if you're engaging in a study of law or you're about to participate in an online classroom as you are about the study of law, it is only important that we equip you with certain tools that prepare you for that process. And so over the last 3 programs, we've been conducting what we term as our foundational series, looking at the definition of law, moving on from there to talk about the Liberian legal system, and then also traveling along to look at indispensable principles that one must bear in mind when we talk about matters that are legal in nature. And having dispensed with those foundational series, we now officially commence what we will term as the first major substantive law intervention. And if you follow the previous series, when we say substantive law, we're pretty much referring to the letter of the law. And by saying the letter of the law, we're referring to what the text or laws that have been enacted or promulgated, what exactly do they say on any matter for that matter. As a case in point today, our conversation is going to focus on the Decent Work Act of Liberia. The Decent Work Act of Liberia, passed in 2015. And for those of you who may not know, the Decent Work Act of Liberia is basically the law that governs labor relations within the republic, aside from those who work for government. So if you're within the civil service, this law does not concern you. It does not govern your relationships or how you engage with government entities. But any other particular labor issue or work issue that happens outside of the civil service, then the Decent Work Act of 2015 rather is what is controlling and what has legal effect or regulation on your activity. And that's why it is important for one to understand what the Decent Work Act of 2015 says about labor relations, about employer-employee relations, about the rights employees have as well as the rights that employers have, and how they're supposed to be treated within the work environment. And that's the conversation we're about to commence today. As we said to you before, this is an online classroom, so the idea is that we will commence the conversation focusing on this specific topic. In this case, it happens to be the Decent Work Act of 2015, which is Liberia's labor law. But we may not exhaust all of that within one session, so we'll continue a conversation until we come to a conclusion of a particular law or a particular code or a particular act, and then we will transition to the next one. So we're now starting off by looking at labor relations, or the law that governs labor relations within the Republic of Liberia. Today we're going to focus on three aspects of the Decent Work Act or of the labor law. The labor law itself comprises 11 parts and 46 chapters. So it's a quite comprehensive document that basically includes all of the different provisions that should govern labor relations or employer-employee relations within the Republic of Liberia. However, within this particular program, we're going to focus on the first three parts of the labor law or the Decent Work Act of Liberia. Now, the question becomes, what are those three parts? Firstly, we're going to look at what I call the introduction, the preliminary provisions that are contained in the Act. Any law, for that matter, normally we start by explaining a couple of things about itself, and that is what we refer to as the introductory aspect. And then there are what they term as preliminary provisions. Basically, these are inscriptions within the law that set the basis for you to understand what the law is supposed to address. After we've looked at the preliminary or the introductory provisions, then we'll move on to look at fundamental rights that are guaranteed under the Decent Work Act of 2015, which means this is a very important area for employers and employees to take note, because it basically atomizes what the rights that employees have, what are the rights that also employers have, and how the expectation that the law has in terms of behavior between the two parties. And then after that, we'll look at the various institutions that are supposed to govern the relationship between these two very important sets of people, that is employer and employee. So we'll take a very short break, and then when we return, we'll start out by going into the different parts that we've just articulated. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the program, What the Law Says. So as we indicated, today our focus is on the Decent Work Act of Liberia, passed in 2015. If you just go by the name alone, you're informed that it talks about decency, and therefore you know that the Decent Work Act is basically saying that as an employer or an employee, there is some type of requirement that the law in Liberia possesses or articulates about the nature of how and where we work and the rights that we have, that they ought to be decent. And so today, out of the 11 chapters that exist, we're going to look at parts 1, 2, and 3 of the Decent Work Act of the Labor Law of the Republic of Liberia. As we indicated before, the first part we're going to address, have a conversation about today, happens to be the introduction and preliminary provisions. As I said before, when you have laws, normally when you read laws, you see that in the very early portions of the law, they tend to include different provisions that are supposed to inform you about why this law in the first place, as well as who it applies to, as well as different other issues that are associated with the law. And there is a tendency for legislative drafters, those who write laws, to title these things as the introduction or the preliminary provisions. So we'll start with the introduction or preliminary provisions of the Decent Work Act of 2015. And that is supposed to give you a clear idea about why this law exists and what it seeks to regulate within the Liberian jurisdiction. The first portion of the Decent Work Act, particularly under the preliminary provisions that we're going to look at today, is firstly the purpose. And this is only natural that one begins to unpack or to investigate the purpose of the law, because one must understand a law or a regulation or whatever instrument that is intended to constrain or to direct behavior within a particular jurisdiction. The first place one must start is by looking at the purpose. Why does this law exist in the first place? Now, if you go back to the act or the law itself, you see there are a multiplicity of things that are included in there that are describe the purpose. But I've managed to boil that down to three or so core issues that I believe that the Decent Work Act was coined or was enacted to address. The first one I believe is that the Decent Work Act was coined or enacted to regulate our working environment such that number one, we are able to have or to promote quality employment. It's important to understand that quality employment, that it is not just about workers working or being employed, but that the nature of the employment has to be one of quality. And we all know when we say quality, what we mean is something that is durable, something that is worthy of replication. So the first purpose of the act is to provide for quality employment. The second purpose of the act, as restated by me, but inclusive in the general description within the act, is to ensure that workers are able to exercise their fundamental rights at work. Now, fundamental rights is another section that we will eventually arrive at, so I don't want to put the cart before the horse. But it's important that we begin to understand at the early phase that a work environment is not a military camp. That is an environment that is supposed to be governed by egalitarian principles, meaning of respect, of engagement, of camaraderie, of friendship. Of course, not sacrificing the core purpose of being there, that you must do your job, but also it doesn't mean that it will exist void of that kind of environment. So the second purpose of this act is to ensure that work environment is an environment in which that fundamental rights are respected. The third is about social protection. And by social protection, it brings into mind questions of sexual and gender-based rights, meaning, how do we protect and ensure that women in the work environment are not exploited or violated or threatened based on their sexuality or discriminated against. Those are issues of social protection. And the other point that this act seeks to also regulate is that Liberia happens to be a part of many international organizations, particularly the International Labor Organization (ILO), which is, if you ask me, is an intergovernmental human rights organization, a UN intergovernmental human rights organization that basically advocates better work conditions for people all across the globe. And Liberia, as a member, has obligations under those different treaties that they've signed. So this act is also meant to enforce that. And finally, this act is meant to establish transparent institutions that can address violations. So most often we have laws and they're promulgated or enacted to address particular situations. In this case, Act of 2015 is meant to address workplace environment and the rights that we possess and Liberia's own responsibilities under the law. But sometimes there are violations. And this act also provides for institutions or mechanisms that can address these violations when and if they do occur. So that's the purpose. Why do we have a Decent Work Act? One, we need a law that will regulate the work environment by ensuring that there is quality employment. by ensuring that workers can exercise their fundamental rights freely at work, by ensuring that there is social protection, by ensuring that Liberia respects her obligations under international law or with their regards to her membership of the International Labour Organization, and also by ensuring that there are transparent organizations and entities that can address questions of violations if they were to occur. So that's the purpose. Now, how the second part we look at under these preliminary provisions, this is just to set the stage before we go into actual content. And I'm hoping that we will exhaust this whole labor law over a three-part series, starting with this one today, a second edition, and then a third edition, because it's quite extensive and some of the details here require very detailed explanation so that people are able to understand. The second part to look at then is the question of interpretation, meaning how is it meant for the law to be interpreted? Again, legislative drafters normally will include something around interpretation, mainly to clarify that under whose laws are we interpreting these particular provisions, because certain legal jargons or words that are included in laws may not have the same meaning in different countries. So in the case of Liberia, in terms of interpretation, meaning if a foreign company were to come to Liberia and there's a question of a violation and the Decent Work Act is being utilized in order to resolve that violation, that company cannot argue that we use the laws of my home country as interpretation, because the Decent Work Act clearly states that interpretation should be in line with Liberian law, but also in line with our international treaties that we've signed, amongst others. So that's the question of interpretation. How do we interpret the Decent Work Act? We interpret it within the framework of the Liberian jurisprudence, but more than that, we also look to our different treaty obligations that we have. Now, having looked at purpose of the law and how the law is to be interpreted, we must then look at what I call certain key definitions. Definitions in the law means that as we go through this process of unpacking the Decent Work Act, there will be certain phrases, certain words that we'll continue to use, and we don't want to have you possess the assumption that whatever definition you have about that rule or that law is what applies. Because in the eyes of the law, when they state a particular word or phrase, there is a clear meaning that is ascribed to that particular word or to that particular phrase. And so, again, this is not an exact replica of everything that's in the Decent Work Act. I've just managed to pull out some of the different definitions that I believe are very much material for our conversation. So some of those definitions include things like a casual employee. And the reason I pull these out is because when rights, especially of workers, are being questioned, or when there are issues that are being raised, there are certain defenses that employers normally use in order to dismiss those rights. So therefore, these definitions are important because they classify or clarify exactly what is meant by certain things, so that they cannot just be waived, on the basis of technicality. So the first one is about a casual employee. So every time we hear a casual employee, what does that mean in terms of the Decent Work Act? We say basically a casual employee is basically a part-time worker, someone who's engaged on an hourly basis, and not someone who has fixed employment. Why is it important to point that out? It's important to point that out because there are different rights that attach to people if they are casual, and there are different rights that attach to people if they are fixed employees. And it's important to draw the distinction. The second point we want to define is a code of good practice. And basically, a code of good practice is a document that the Decent Work Act mandates all employers to have. And that is what sometimes we refer to as the employee's handbook, where in that document is inscribed all of the rights you have, but also is there inscribed processes for disciplinary action against you, if you engage in certain things, and therefore they call it a code of good practice. Thirdly, we want to talk about a collective agreement. A collective agreement basically is the fact that the law provides, and we'll talk about that when we talk about fundamental rights, that workers in any entity everywhere are entitled to form unions, wherein comes the whole idea of a collective, meaning there's a group of people. They are entitled also meaning that it is their right to form unions and to come together and negotiate as a black for better work conditions. And in that particular respect, a collective agreement is basically saying that workers who are in a particular group or entity can come together and decide on a way in which to engage as a collective, right? And then there's something called a conciliator as well. A conciliator basically is someone who's supposed to serve as an umpire, and that person is the one who intervenes or gets involved with managing disputes between the parties that are involved. Beyond the conciliator, we have definitions like continuous service, whether you've been working at an entity for a long period uninterrupted, and that whole idea of a continuous service affects benefits that you can get. You also have full-time employment. It's important to also point that out. The Decent Work Act defines full-time employment as someone who works for 5 days a week and not less than 40 hours. So that is a full-time employment. And then finally, in terms of our in terms of our definitions, we have what we term as the minimum wage board. And that minimum wage board, as some of us may know, is intended to set standards for how workers are supposed to be provided benefits commensurate with the type of work that they do. Under the part of looking at the preliminary provisions, we will end on application before we go for our break, and then we can open the lines as we begin to move forward. Application. So application basically is about who does this law apply to? Meaning, we have a Decent Work Act, but does it apply to everyone within our jurisdiction, as we are prone to say, or is it only for select people? And according to the Decent Work Act, once there is work occurring in Liberia, and there's an exception, and I will cite the exception, two major exception. Once there is work occurring within Liberia, work that involves, whether it's a man working or a woman working or a child working, even though there are some issues with child labor, which we'll talk about, whether the person is a citizen or a non-citizen, or whether the form of work is formal or informal, we say that the Decent Work Act, or the provisions included in the Decent Work Act, is what controls, meaning is what regulates all of that. Now, there are exceptions. This act is only applying to people who are not civil servants. Civil servants basically are people who work for government within the professional employ of government. They are not political appointees. They are not elected officials, but they work within what we term as a civil servant. They are generally recruited for life, and they are professionals, and their stay in government basically goes beyond elections or political arrangements. So for them, the civil service agency has particular rules that apply. However, once it's not government, any other form of employment, the Decent Work Act applies to you. In addition to that exception, the other exception that comes into play are for those whose work basically involves maritime activity, meaning working on ships. As some of us know, commerce between countries primarily carried out through shipping, and you have people who work on ships on the waters. There is a great deal, and maritime law is a separate place, separate discipline all by itself that govern how we treat those people who work on ships and on other places. So just to recap before we take our break and then we move to our next section. So the first part is basically looking at the preliminary provisions, meaning that sets the stage for understanding the Decent Work Act. And very briefly, we've looked at one. What is the Decent Work Act about? It's about labor relations, it's about employer-employee relations, and it's a law that governs all of that. Now, there are three parts we're supposed to look at. We started out by looking at the preliminary provisions. We look at the purpose. We look at the interpretation. We look at key definitions, and we've looked at the application. Who does it apply to, and what are the exceptions? Now we're going to very briefly take our break, and then we announce if you are interested in participating or you have particular questions or comments that you would like to post, you can dial in on 0880 514 096, 0880 514 096 in order to participate on the program. Welcome back to the program, What the Law Says. We have a caller on the line.
Hello?
Hello?
Hello? Yeah, hello. My name is David P. Flomo, and I call you from the Boulevard, Second Boulevard.
Go ahead, David.
All right. I just wanted to know, in terms of application, if whether what the law says about contractors. When you have hired certain group of people on a contract basis, how long should that person serve as a contractor in that entity and be employed? Is the law say anything as it relates to that?
Your question is well noted. We'll respond to that shortly. Do we have another caller on the line? So we'll come to this question very shortly as we move along, but that's a very important question. What does the law say about contractors? We normally say, not in law, but even in literature, but also applicable in law, that if it quacks like a duck, then it must be a duck. What am I saying? It is not about the nomenclature that an employer decides to place on an employee that determines the category of the relationship between them. Rather, it is the nature of the activity that they are both involved with. So, a part-time or a casual laborer is stated that you are hired on an hourly basis, and this is a non-continuous service, meaning you hire hourly, you don't work hour after hour, and it is irregular, and therefore we consider you as casual or contracted labor. However, if in the course of carrying out your duties, you seem to not be acting casually, but now you're coming to work as a full-time employee, which means you're working every day a week, 40 hours over the week, then we don't classify you again as casual. You are an employee. So it's not about the nomenclature, whether they call you a contractor or not. It's about the nature of the interaction between employer and employee. We have another call on the line. Hello? I think we lost that caller. So yeah, let's continue by looking. Hello?
Hello.
Your name and where you call from, and what's your question?
Well, I'm Milton Bismore, calling from Electoral District for Grand Bassa County, Yellow Plantation.
Let's hear you, Small.
I want to comment our brother in studio trying to explain about the Decent Work Act, which is we have been placed in the law, in the handbill. But my question has to do with Civil 7 law. Since
people go into the government employment area. What is the cause that and salary cannot be increased after 2 to 3, 4 fiscal budgets have been passed? What is the cause? Like example, if you are on $100, you be on that $100 until 5 to 6 years pass. What is the cause that it cannot be increased? Or every budget year can civil servants get addition of their salary, or it can be reduced, because every time we require adequate a reduction of our salary and our government teachers and government paid teachers for every kind of reduction. And it cannot be increased after fiscal budgets have been passed. Why is it cause?
Thank you very much, Sumo. In regards to civil servants' salary, if you recall when I spoke to the definitions under the Decent Work Act, even though, like I said before, the Decent Work Act basically is to regulate relationships that are outside of government, employer-employee relationships that are outside of government, whereas the Civil Service Act regulates relationships within government. But that said, even within the Decent Work Act, there is something called the Minimum Wage Board. And that Minimum Wage Board is the entity created by law under the Decent Work Act that is responsible to continuously do assessments of the employment environment and advise the Ministry of Labor to provide to government suggestions about what is a living wage or what is supposed to be paid at certain levels of employment. And that minimum wage board is active. However, you must also take into consideration that the increment of salary does not happen in one space. It happens across the board. So if you're increasing salary for teachers in Grand Bassa, you're increasing salary for teachers everywhere. And there are financial implications for that. But then again, it is a minimum wage board that is supposed to address that. Hello?
Yes, my name is Daniel Dean. I'm calling from the Robertsville Highway.
Yes, Daniel.
Okay. Thank you, first of all, for this very informative program, and I think it will help a lot of people, understand their rights in a way. But I have 2 questions for you. One is a follow-up from the first caller when you talked about a contractor or a casual labor. So, I mean, an employee and then casual labor. So, for example, you're working the normal 48 hours, but your contract is renewable after every 1 year. You're still a contractor. When do you become a full employee where you are no longer signing contracts? That's the first question. The second question is, how is your leave calculated? So, for example, annual leave calculated. For example, you have an employee that have worked for a company for more than, let's say, 5, 6 years, and they haven't taken a leave, and the company haven't paid them their leave. But over the period of time, your salary changes. And now you engage the employer for your leave, and the employer says, okay, we want to calculate your leave based upon your year 1 salary. Every year, we'll calculate it based upon that salary. Is that how it's supposed to be, or your total leave is calculated on your current salary? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Very important question. Let's take the other question, and then we'll come back to both because there's someone on the line. Hello? There's no one on the line. So, Daniel, very, very valuable questions here. When are you not a contractor? So let me double back again. I think we have another caller on the line. Let's just take that and we'll respond to both. Yes? Hello, welcome to the program, What the Law Says.
Yeah, hello, my name is Gabriel Williams, and I'm calling from TDG Party.
Yes, Gabriel, go ahead, please, very quickly.
Okay, I want to know if a company hire you or employ you, and we all give you a handbook to go on you, and they get desire to put it down, or if something goes wrong, how do the law defend you in that way?
Thank you. Very important question as well. Do we have another caller on the line? Let's take that call as well. Yes, hello, welcome.
Yeah, come to the bar. This is William for Fear. One of your mobilizers that was don't stand up there at the time for you for your election at district league.
Welcome, William. So you have a question?
Yeah. Well, Councillor, there is no question per se. I just love your program, and I want to recommend that this series of your program should be extended, established to our local radio, back home, because our people know they listen to the national radio, which is ELBC, but they widely listen to smart radio, which is the local radio. So I wanted your particular program for you to establish it on our side, because it will be, very beneficial from our people, beneficial for our people. So I want you to really establish that program there. Yeah.
Very well noted, Williams. Thank you so much for the recommendation. So let's look at the questions that were asked. Let's start with Gape, who talked about if a company hires you, does not present you a handbook, and then eventually you're made redundant, what can you do? Firstly, and we'll get to that point, we'll talk about, when I went through the definitions and I said something about what we call a code of good practice. That code of good practice is what is basically the handbook that every entity that employs, is an employer, ought to have that document that spells out the rights of workers, the responsibilities of workers, and how disciplinary action can be taken against you. And all of those should be placed within that particular document, and part of what we call your onboarding, meaning, or orientation, as we say. In the UN sector, they'll say onboarding. In other places, they'll say orientation. When you're brought into the entity, you're supposed to be trained or informed about the rules that apply. So if they didn't give that to you, that's an oversight. They must give it to you according to the law. You're entitled to have that, so you know your rights within that entity. Because all entities are different. Their rules, their benefits, whatsoever, they're different, but they ought to give it to you. Now, if you're made redundant or laid off without any notice whatsoever, the first thing is to consult. That's what I would advise. Consult a lawyer as to what your rights are. That lawyer will evaluate your position, noting firstly the nature of your employment. Were you a casual laborer? Were you a contractor? Are you a long-term employee? What does the different regulations they have say about the benefits you have? Can they terminate you? Can they not terminate you? For cause, what cause was there for them to terminate you? Then that lawyer will advise you as to your rights. And once the lawyer believes, based on an evaluation of your unique situation, will recommend a process that involves either engaging the Ministry of Labor. Firstly, failing a hearing, going to labor court, and then failing that, an appeal to the Supreme Court. At some point in time, the matter gets resolved within that whole adjudicatory process, meaning the process of finding an answer to your problem that goes through the processes. Daniel, when not a contractor, which is like a rehash of the first question, and how one calculates leave. I'll start with calculating leave. This leave calculation depends on the nature of the employer. There are some entities in my close to 17 years of paid employment. There are some entities that will give you paid leave, because sometimes employees, we don't want to take leave, so at the end of the day, we can monetize our leave and take the cash. And I know, based on my history, there's some folks who will do that, so that eventually when you're leaving the organization, your leave is also calculated and paid to you in cash. And some organizations will allow that. Other organizations, just for the fact that they said, according to them, your work-life balance is very important. So we can just have you working 24/7, 7 days, 5 days a week, 4 weeks a month, 12 months a year, and you don't take a break. So they insist that you take leave and that you don't accumulate leave. I think before, someone used to say more than 60-day leave, they maintain it currently and they don't roll it over. That's in established work entities. So again, that leave issue depends on the nature of the organization and their internal rules, which goes back to the code of good practice. Once you join an organization or an entity, they are supposed to onboard you with the rules that apply. So you know exactly that. If I don't take my leave, I can monetize it, meaning I can cash in at some point, Or if I don't take it, I will lose it at the end of the day. There has to be an understanding early as to what the entity does in regards to leave, so you don't make an assumption. When not a contractor, like I said before, it is not about the nomenclature, it's not about semantics, it's about the reality. So, for example, the Decent Work Act defines a worker as someone who is part of an organization providing work, or a person who has worked an average for 40 hours per month over the last 3 months, a person who depends economically on another person for income, a person who is provided tools of a trade by another person to engage in that trade. That's a worker. Now, some people may claim, no, he does not work for me, or she does not work for me, or he is not my employee, or I'm not the one employing him. It's not about what you say. It's about what the law says. What does the law say regarding who is a worker or an employee? It spells that out. So if it falls within that ambit, that person is your employee. And most times we overlook these things with people who work in our homes, like the maids, the other people who are there. They come there every day. They have term employment with you. They work 8 hours a day, and they have rights as well. But we tend to think that they're not so-called employees because they're not in a formal setting, so to speak. But if you go back to how we define this act, it applies to everyone. And once you fall within the definition of being a worker, this act applies to you, and then there are certain rights that attach as a result of what the rules here say. And the minimum wage itself has set a basis for even casual employees, how much they're supposed to make at a certain level. All right, so that's the idea. But when not a contractor, once the relationship starts to resemble a permanent employee, you're working more than 3 months, you've been employed, you've been working those 40-hour weeks for that entity, yet in your contract, they're saying you're a contractor. No, you're not a contractor, because the nature of the work is not contractual work. Contractual work is where you come in on a part-time basis and you leave totally. But if you're there consistently over a period, then that is not contractual work. I hope we're clear. And it's not the same as a contract. This is looking at contractual labor. Right? So having dispensed with that, we have very limited time left dealing with the questions. We'll just start out the next portion of looking at fundamental rights. We're just beginning to even get warmed up. Now we have another caller on the line. It's good to take the calls.
Yeah, good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon. Your name and where you call from?
This is Jeremiah Bagway from Rehab.
Yes, Jeremiah, let's hear you. Very quickly, we have limited time. We're only taking questions now.
Yeah, so shortly, sorry. I got the program later, but something I just wanted to know, if someone can work for like an entity for like more than 9 years without getting a benefit or a leave, and then to get tired and want to leave, what is the step to take for the years to work for without being able to have a benefit and all of stuff? If you just want to leave, I want for the boss to clear everything.
And the person wants to leave.
Yeah.
Okay, well noted.
So tired. Yeah.
All right, well noted. We have another caller there. Hello.
Hello.
Yes, please go ahead. We have very limited time.
Yeah, okay, I'm Garrison Yankee calling from Cheltenham, Bombing County.
Let's hear you, Garrison.
Only go straight to the point with my question. Can one sign a contract that does not specify the salary you work for? My first question. The next thing, is there anything you call voluntary worker in your company? Thank you very much.
Very important questions. We have another caller, and let's take that. Yes?
Yeah, good afternoon, good afternoon to the ELBC family.
How are you doing? Welcome. Very quickly, let's have your concern.
Yeah, I'm Abdullah calling for Central Morocco.
Let's go ahead, Abdullah.
My question is, a company who employ a person for the council of 10 years, and the 10 years have not reached the class to lay off the person, will add a person committing any transgression or any act that will breach their law. How does the labor law apply there?
Thank you very much, Abdullah. Do we have another caller there? I think we can close up on these three. If we still have time, then we'll come back. So let's start with Garrison. Garrison says that, can you sign a contract that does not specify a salary? In my view, no, Garrison. Fundamentally, under contract law, there's something we call consideration. Consideration is basically the price of the contract, meaning when you work, you ought to get paid. And in fact, under common law, in the early days of contracting, the lack of consideration were grounds for declaring a contract to be invalid. So, no, a contract must specify remuneration in some form or manner, because consideration need not be cash, but it has to be a thing of value and it has to be specified in the contract. I think the second question from Garrison was about a voluntary worker. Now, that's more like a paradox because a volunteer is not necessarily an employee. And it's important to specify and clarify this because I know in Liberia there's a tendency where sometimes, and both sides can err, the employer and the volunteer. So the employer will say we are recruiting volunteers and we pay them a stipend. And that will be communicated very clearly. But then the volunteers come in and they start thinking that they are employees. And then eventually start to request benefits not commensurate with the status in which they joined the organization. So there's no voluntary worker. It's either you're an employee or you're a volunteer. And if you're a volunteer, they will categorize what you do by providing a stipend. However, there's a tendency also for volunteer labor to be abused. So if at some point in time what that particular volunteer is doing becomes the core of the activity of the organization, then one cannot argue that they are volunteer anymore. We have a similar situation within the UN sector, but the nuances are quite different. But to put it strictly, volunteers are different, employees or workers are different, and their benefits are also very different. It's important to clarify before you assume any rule or any kind of specification. Jeremiah, 9 years, you tired, you want to leave. Again, go back to the policy of the organization as well as the labor law required. Looking at what you are entitled to, that specifies your benefits. There's nothing that says that you must work forever. However, there is a cutoff point at which you work that you get entitled to some form of benefits. Like I know when you're with the UN, for example, after the first 5 years, they start to match your pension contributions. So you are entitled to those contributions from your pension that they are matching after you work for 5 years. But if you leave 4 years and 11 months, you are not entitled. So there's a time frame that's also attached in order for you to get those benefits. So if you want to resign, you're free to go. But if you don't reach the level that is required before you can get additional benefits from the organization, then you have to go back to NASCO and get your pension, whatever other contributions that you've made over those 9 years. But you are free to leave. That's part of your fundamental rights as a worker. They can keep you there. When you want to leave, it's your right to leave. And finally, Abdullah, you say about your tenure not over, meaning you have a contract with an entity and they want to relieve you. There are two ways that issue is resolved.